Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Tony, for the invitation. It's such an honor. I'm definitely coming from a sort of like a background that might be a bit of a challenge to kind of like motivate you into the topics that I'm going to talk about. But I have to be actually extremely motivated on the other way around. Say that my field is like in memory research. I'm basically focused on understanding how the brain basically supports memory functioning in humans. So that's why I'm speaking about the system level scale. But recently, for the last 3-4 years, I've been kind of like slightly like pursued to kind of like shift my interest to implement some sort of to kind of like bring technology to try to resolve some of the puzzles that we are currently not understanding yet in the human cognitive neuroscience field. So the idea of my talk, if I manage to do it well, is to kind of like bring up a few data from experiments that are basically focused on understanding one specific neural mechanism that I think it's kind of like crucial to explain some of the problems or the major problems that the cognitive neuroscience field of memory try to address. The good thing about this mechanism is that for the last 3 years, it also inspired us to move towards more ecological, valid experimental models and try to understand how memory functioning might work outside the lab, which is currently an important topic. Not just because of like understanding the human brain, but also because it may also help to kind of like develop strategical therapeutical strategies to treat clinical patients with neurological damage, for instance, which is an issue that we also focus on. After the inspiring talk from Paul, I feel a bit tired about this point, but I really like appreciate if you just like put your hands up whenever you have a question. I don't know your background, so many and like challenges might bring up here. So just please stop my talk and just ask if you don't get into the point, or I just speak a bit faster, as you might have already noticed. So before starting, I'll try to calm down a bit. So before starting, I think it's I always like to acknowledge those who have like been involved in most of the things that I'm going to present today. We do have a group in Bellvitge, in the hospital nearby, in the campus of medicine in there, and we also like work in the faculty of psychology. So our field is like in the kind of like bridging the gap between psychology, medicine, and maybe the future technology as well. I hope. So this is like the people who's currently working in my group, and I want to talk about like data of results that are basically explored by these people, highlighted in blue. We work heavily with people from the epilepsy unit in the hospital of Bellvitge. Julia Miro and myself, they're basically really like generous to accept the invitation or to basically invite us to run experimental projects with neurological cases. Some of them are a bit weird, as you may see afterwards. And we do have like kind of like a plenty of collaboration outside. And I'm going to talk today specifically focusing on one of the projects that we're running with Chris Baldassano from Princeton, I think currently in Columbia. So this is a kind of like a very summary of like an index of my talk. So I'll start focusing a bit on one specific mechanism that I think is quite relevant, because it will make us try to understand how several major problems of memory are basically supporting the brain, which is memory reactivation. I will expose a couple of like line of research done in our lab that are regards on like sleep memory consolidation and working memory. I will explain the data afterwards. And based on these findings, on the second part of my talk, I will speak about recent projects that basically challenge our kind of like comfort zone of the lab and try to address problems in a more realistic scenarios. So I think it's kind of like one of the nice things that we should, or one of the important things we should know about memory and stuff, is that one of the most known aspects of memory is that, in fact, most of our experiences tend to be forgotten. This is like a known phenomenon, or known model, or known data set actually from Ebbinghaus from like 19th century. And basically, it described how, which is the probability of like recalling events after encoding them. And this is expressed on this timeline, and as a function of like percentage of attention. And this kind of like function, which increases exponentially, shows that actually the ability to recall information right after encoding it decreases dramatically from the very beginning. And that's a fact that has been replicated many, many, many times, not even like from the lab or kind of like a material that has nonsense, but also like for important aspects of our day life. So it seems actually, which is kind of like puzzling by itself, that our memory system, one of the most puzzling aspects is that it basically forgets things, right? So basically, now here it says that most of the information tends to be forgotten in the very beginning, let's say after a few hours. So the idea is that the probability that you might remember 50% of this talk tomorrow is slightly low. But it also tells us that there's some sort of like stage at which some of this information prevails. And it's stored there, and you can recall them forever and ever of your life. So it seems actually there's a challenge here, right? On the one hand, forgetting acts strategy, and very importantly, on the other hand, some of this information is preserved forever and ever. So now, which other variables that might be important here? So basically, EDIBELL, and we still believe in it, at the cognitive neuroscientific level, we believe actually that strength of the memories and the passage of time are the two critical ingredients to understand how this function is implemented in the brain. Now, that's cool, that's good, this function works well, but suddenly, after a while, some researchers also noticed something quite spectacular in my view, I'd say. So there's the forgetting cue, which seems to be prevalent in our kind of like anything that can be is automatic, right? We cannot just avoid it. Suddenly they just noticed that this retention period, this time period that elapsed between encoding and retention, right? The state of your brain was relevant to modify it. So basically, they showed in a few participants that after encoding few letters, right, the ability to retain this information and to preserve it for a long time, for hours, depended on whether you were in between sleeping or awake. So it seemed actually that if you were sleeping, so the retention period, the period between encoding and recall, you were sleeping, this forgetting cue was not that high, right? And that brought actually an important aspect that we believe these days that sleep is the fundamental brain state through which memories are consolidated. So we do believe actually that this kind of like an important state in which no information from environment is entering into your brain facilitates or promotes specific neural mechanisms that allow some or certain memories to be strengthened and to be consolidated, that's what we say. Now the prevailing model based on computational or theoretical models assumes that the way these mechanisms take place in the brain is through a dual process that involves the hippocampus and the cortical regions. So whenever a memory is formed, it involves a kind of like a trace representation that is stored in the hippocampus. Sleep, for a certain time, sleep promotes some mechanisms that allows this memory trace to be transferred to other regions, to neocortical regions, right, that might store that and might be less susceptible to interference, so that it frees again the hippocampus to keep on learning or to incorporate new memories. This is the model. This is a theoretical model. Now this model has been tested like several times, especially in humans, but also in animals. But the critical point is, if this is true, there should be a mechanism, right, that allows the brain to transfer this information to other regions during sleep. And which is this mechanism? One of the things, or one of the critical mechanisms that we believe is important for that, is that during sleep, memories that have been encoded during the the preceding time points, these memories are replayed, so that the hippocampus replaces information facilitating the transfer to the cortical region. That's the standard model. So do we have evidence for this? In fact, we do. This is like a paper on rodents that use like a single cell recordings, multi-unit, together with local potentials in the hippocampus, and in the cortical regions. So now what's important here? So we know from rat studies, from rodents, that there's a kind of like a characteristic coding mechanism that basically integrates spatial information about our environment. So for instance, whenever we move around, right, there's a coding principle by which specific positions in space are coded by specific neurons. That's what it's called, like place cells, which together with the grid cells gave the Nobel Prize winning 4 years ago, right? 40. So that basically it's a signal that codifies exactly or represents how the spatial environment is memorized or is transformed into a memory store. So can we basically code, can we pick up this information? Well, yes we do, but not ourselves, right? So the animal people can do that. So basically, they can characterize how an animal, how a rodent is basically moving along a path that could be linear in that case, and how several cells, right, in the hippocampus, or in the cortex, or in the hippocampus, might basically trigger whenever this position changes over the time in a sequence fashion. We can also calculate the local field potential and to see that there's some sort of a sequentiality of this movement. That's an important issue. We are not going to enter into this today. But the good thing is that we do have a way to trace a representation. So far, we can index how the memory is represented in the brain and see if this specific neural pattern is reactivated, if you wish, in moments in which the animal is not directly experiencing this impulse, which would be the case, for instance, during yes.
Is this cell coactivation occurring during awake states?
Yes.
So you would have place cells in the cortex?
So you would have?
Place cells in the cortex?
Well, that's what they claim, right? They would say, well, that's what the human people say, maybe. So the whole point, it seems that it seems to be that there's certain specific areas in the brain that seems to be modulated similarly as the hippocampus, or at least the grid cells are doing in rhinal cortex. Whether you can claim that they are truly using exactly the same mechanism or not, it's a topic of research these days.
Yeah, but if we're assuming that those hippocampal cells are place cells and they are arranged that way because we know the spatial arrangement, you also target or identify cells in the cortex. That means that you could test whether they are spatially selected as well.
Well, maybe the problem here is to understand or try to bring the possibility that actually what is happening in here is because it's coordinated by the hippocampus, right? So the idea is that is it like triggering this activity by itself, as if it was on its own place cells itself, or its activity that it's truly coordinated by a place cell and giving the code back projected to the cortex.
Excuse me.
So, yes.
But the cortex seems to start firing earlier than the place cells.
Well, it could be like a sensory input, isn't it?
So it's not an activity that is driven solely by the place cells.
Well, the point comes up here. I'll show you. Because when you're sleeping, right, you don't have a cortical input. You don't have a sensory input itself.
Yeah.
But that's not, sorry. Let me just fly over a bit on this data set because, well, it's not my research. I don't know the details, that details exactly. But what it's, I think this is an important aspect. At least with neuroimaging, people have shown that this grid coding scheme that has been attributed to rhinal cortex in rodents many times, right? So the scheme itself and the mechanisms and the assumptions it take can or seem to be also obtained in other cortical areas like the parietal cortex and frontal regions. So these papers are there, and actually, I think they're bringing out important questions. This coding scheme is also represented somewhere in the cortex. I think that the question is still not resolved these days, but definitely it's an important topic. So basically,
where in the cortex are we now?
in visual areas.
This is only visual.
Yeah, this is
Where is it?
in the
Visual.
areas. That's not a paper from I don't remember the name. It shows something similar in frontal regions as well. Something similar, I'd say. The coordination itself. So that's what they found actually when the rodents were sleeping. So they just showed they could identify during the activity that similar sequence of activity also reinstated. So this phenomena, right, has been shown in many other labs. People who specifically explored a rodent unit, single cell unit activity, and it's been seems to be a kind of a proof actually that this replay phenomena is truly taking place in mammals, let's say. Yes.
Yeah, sorry, this is a completely naive question.
Yeah, sure.
So, is this what underlies that experience that certainly I've had, where you're doing some physical exercise or something relatively intense during the day, and at night when you're sleeping, it's almost like you're feeling it again, like you're visualizing, you're literally feeling it again. Is that part of this?
Well, I guess that's, I would like to say yes, but I guess that this is like so the direct transformation from this sort of like single cell unit recordings to a subjective phenomena, like this sort of intense vividness of like memories. I think there's a gap in between, right?
Because
but
I mean, you're not going to store a memory, I would think, of something that's just a casual thing that happened to you. Presumably it would be something that has to cross.
There's a prioritization. There's definitely a prioritization. We know that. We know that this replay activity is modulated by the motivational factors, for instance, on the one hand. There's also like a model, or basically, it seems that something that you might consider relevant for the future, not by now, but for the future, also like highlights or emphasize or basically increase the replay activity. We know that, especially with rodents, you can do that with rewards, for instance. And in humans, it has been replicated psychologically or behaviorally, let's say. So it seems that that's an issue. Whether the rest of the information is not replayed at any point, I think that's a mystery. Yeah. So I guess the forgetting cube itself, it's like an issue, right? To what extent this information disappears completely, or it's subjected to sort of a different sort of like mechanism. It's still a puzzle. But that's a good point, yes. Right. So just let me move on to this a bit. So basically the question we wondered like a few years ago is whether this sort of like model or these principles, these are kind of like mechanistic principles, if you wish, right? The idea that the hippocampus, right, triggers a reactivation of a stored memory representation, right, facilitating or kind of like strengthening this memory to be preserved over time. That was something that was not tested in humans, the basic principle mechanism. So that's what we wanted to do, actually. And so that's basically the model or the idea, the hypothesis we have, right? But this is like the idea, right? We initially create a memory trace, which is like involves the hippocampus initially, and through memory replay, that basically strengthens this memory over time, which basically allows it to or avoids forgetting, right? But how to do that in humans? You cannot go right and do a few issues. So we had this idea of like testing this model with neurological patients who have specific lesions in targeted areas. In that case, this would be the hippocampus. And for that, we selected like a chronic epileptic patients from the hospital of Bellvitge. And we selected like a group of patients who had like sclerosis, let's say like malfunctioning hippocampus unilaterally, so that the other one was preserved. And we also selected like a group of people, not that many because it's not just that common, a group of people who had like a malfunction, specifically in hippocampus bilaterally. Right? We also collected data from a control of healthy subjects, age match, all that kind of matching things. Now, right, so we have a population which might allow us to make inferences about this model, but we do need experimental setup that allows us to specifically test this possibility. And that's what we do. So how to test these possibilities, right? We cannot trace like place cells in humans so far, so we need to make some samples. So this is how the experiment started, and that's what I presented to the neurologists when I arrived there, and they thought I was completely nuts. But I think it worked well at the end. So the whole idea is that we want patients or people to form new memories, right? So that you can do it with like different ways, like asking them to encode a new words list or images. You can do several things in humans, but we needed something that made specific memories to be associated with the sound. I'll tell you why. So basically, we asked patients to learn an association between a word that showed up in a picture in a computer, and it was kind of like simultaneously associated with the sound that sounded on the headphones. So there was a list of these associations, that different ones. It took us a while to allow to basically ensure that patients learn this. But once this learning was successfully reached, we asked them to go to sleep, right, at night. They had a normal sleep in the hospital with a peculiarity that, unbeknownst of them, was critical for us. So imagine, sorry, just to come back, what we wanted to test here is that reactivation of information during sleep, right, basically triggers memory consolidation. Now we want to know, we need to understand, or we need to trace that this reactivation comes or happens to a specific memory. But we don't have like a quantification of this kind of like sequence of place cells phenomena. So we need to be slightly more ingenious in that case. So what we did was the following. We randomly selected half of the sounds that were associated with the memories, and we replayed them like kind of like a lower kind of like a level, right? We replayed them while patients were sleeping. We did that specific stage of sleep, that we don't have to get anything for this, that we know it's promoting this sort of like memory consolidation, right? So that after this this reappearance of a sound, we assume that whenever the sound comes in, by pattern completion, the hippocampus might basically reactivate the associated information, and therefore might be susceptible to be strengthened through memory consolidation. So that's the logic, isn't it? Any question on that? Right, so now people just woke up, they didn't understand, everything was happy, they were just stressed, right? And then the way to test this possibility of this hypothesis was to simply ask them, right, to retrieve the information that they previously encoded the day before. Now the idea is that if this sound triggered some sort of like memory replay or memory reinstatement, we should see that the associated memories were less forgotten compared to the others that were not replayed during the night. And that's what we found for the participants. So this is like the capacity of performance, right? For those associations that were, all of them were learned similarly the day before, but the performance for those memories that were reinstated through the sounds overnight. And we see slightly subtle, of course, definitely subtle. Imagine that we could just, like make this forgetting kind of like big. It's subtle but statistically significant. We observed that those memories that were not like, that the reinstatement was not induced artificially, these memories were forgotten in a higher proportion. Now, let's see what happened with the patients that we know that might have like a problem with the hippocampus, which is a critical area for us on the hypothesis that we described. What we observed from patients that have unilateral damage in one of the areas, we observed that even though memory performance was lower, generally speaking, compared to healthy controls, still these benefits of reactivation were observable. Now, critically for us, though, was that actually for bilateral damaged patients, these benefits completely disappeared. So they had an important decrease compared to controls, not statistically significant compared to the unilateral patients, but the important aspect for our design is that this benefit completely disappeared. So we also quantified the extent to which the degree of like the hippocampus spareness, because the hippocampus is not just, it's kind of like a big area, and sometimes the lesion involves just a small volume of it. We basically found that the degree of spareness, let's say how much the hippocampus, the remaining hippocampus is preserved, also correlated with this benefit of reactivation. So I guess that actually, I mean, for us, we thought actually this study provided critical evidence linking the hippocampus with selective memory enhancement for offline reactivation and the light sleep memory consolidation in humans. Any question? Yes, please.
Yeah, sorry. So I maybe when you did the sound playing during the sleep, did you also have a group where you mismatched the sound to the image that they had that was associated with it to see that you're not getting the benefit when you play back the mismatched sound, or that meaning that if you had a subject that got any sound but not the sound that was actually associated with the memory, if the benefit was gone the next time.
Oh, I see. Okay, no, I haven't got it right. So for this experiment, we didn't include sounds that were not associated to anything previously. So it might interfere. But for the next experiment, we did it. Okay. No, that's an important point, right? Yeah, sure. Yes, we included afterwards for the next one. So I'm just trying to bring up a kind of like general aspects that are important in the human field these days. So basically now we know that we do reactivate information during night sleep, and that involves the strengthening of the memory information. But we do have a problem here. So the whole point is that whenever we think about the daylight experience, most of our memories are not static. Say, we cannot just assume that the way we form memories is basically by means of like item 1 together with item 2. It's slightly more complex, we know that, right? So that could be slightly summarized with this, this is like an example. So imagine that, right, that you see whenever you go out one of these days to the park and you see that there's this woman with this dog, right? You can just remember these things, which is quite kind of like a routine-like example. Now, our memory system, right, from the point of view of like what we have expressed so far, these might form a static memory representation, so that this dog comes together with this human. However, imagine that right after, when another moment, maybe the same day, maybe the day after, right, suddenly in another completely spatial context, completely different environment, you see that the same dog reappears again, but now it's basically carried by another person. So I think at this moment, if by this happens, you can come up with a possibility, right, that you saw this dog beforehand, and you might even like make an inferential process to assume that likely these two persons should know each other. Maybe they are married, maybe they're friends, whoever. But you kind of like make this association as well. So the point, right, this is like an important aspect of memory representation, is that somehow, right, we should understand, or we might make the kind of like the effort to understand that this, the way we understand how the memories are formed, is not in a static manner, but in a flexible manner, so that we can renegotiate, if you will, reassociate information quite rapidly. So the question is, if this happens to be the case, as it seems to be quite natural in our brain environment, one of the puzzles is, right, on the context of sleep memory consolidation, is what happened, right, when you reactivate one specific memory to those memories that are overlapping, in essence, right? Can you just build up kind of like a, right, kind of like a network of memories just by triggering one reactivation, you strengthen the rest forever and ever? Does it really happen like this? Does it not? So that was the question that we wanted to address in the next part. So to deal with this, or to address this, we built up, or kind of like created another design, quite simple, in which we asked people to learn the position of two images on a grid. So let's focus on this point. So the people were asked to learn that the dogs, let's say the dog pictures, were placed over these two positions. Right? They were asked afterwards to retrieve. Now, but here we don't want to understand how these memories are strengthened if we reactivate them artificially, because we know that it happens. We want to understand what might happen for any memory that might overlap or might be associated in another level. So for that, we asked these same people, right after learning this, to relearn again, or to enter into another encoding phase in which part of this information, let's say partial features, some of the features of these memories are still preserved, like the position of this dog, but the other, some other ones changed in position. So now they have to learn that actually in this encoding phase, the dogs were displaced, or kind of like displaced in these positions, but not the other ones. So we managed to create two sort of memories that are overlapped in one important feature, which is like a spatial placement, right? So now the question is, right, how do we kind of like reactivate them artificially? So something that we did, and I'll explain, is that during this second memory, but not in the first one, we also, while people were learning this second memory, X1, X3, we also simultaneously played some sounds to specific memories, so that people also associated sounds to this encounter, to this context. And now we used half of these sounds, right, to artificially induce brain statement during sleep. And we also included some kind of like control sounds in here, but thank you. Yeah. Right, so the question is, what's going to happen right after? Reactivating this memory through this kind of like a cue sound would also impact into a completely different memory, sort of like overlapping memory, right, or not? Right, so to do that, we basically given one of the cues, given the stable cue, right, the overlapping cue, to report where the other dog was in the first encounter, or in the first memory, right? So we want to know, right, that through this sound presentation that was directly associated with one specific memory, which was like this length, now we want to know if they have some sort of like a susceptibility, right, to still remember, right, how the dog was placed on the first encounter.
Can you say something about the differences between then the different stimuli? So how different is X1 from X2 and X2 from X3?
So the basics here is that the two memories are highly overlapping in terms of like features, let's say, but only once the spatial feature in one of the elements change. So I think it's quite easy for them to kind of like make or build up some sort of like a link between the two.
So the similarity is what, 80%?
Oh, okay. No, well, yeah, that's. We
Roughly.
didn't calculate that, but we made sure that across events or across stimuli, this position was randomly distributed, so it might not impact into this possibility.
Okay.
But we haven't measured like this sort of like similarity point. But we made sure we made some, right, the proximity to this one, let's say, things like this. So all of them are randomly distributed and controlled for this.
Okay.
So what we saw on the test that they got done, that's an app study, the test is that when you ask people to retrieve the first memory on the basis of whether the sound induced the reactivation of the overlapping memory, they still show some sort of like strengthening, right? Thereby suggesting that actually through this reactivation, it also impacts into the associated memory, which is something that we might goes in line with this sort of like flexible representation of memories, right? I mean, things are basically all connected, and touching or reactivating one of the memories might impact in the other one. Right? And we do have control with wake style. So basically, that's kind of like helpful. I think it was kind of like important for us. But this raises an important question, which is memories, even though they are flexible and they should be like allow us to associate things, this sort of like network memory might easily enter into a clutter or kind of like a chaotic disposition if you don't control or if you don't organize them by means of some principles, whatever they are, right? I think it's known. Whenever you think about the beach, right? Not all the beaches on the world are coming up in your mind. You might just, organize this information substantively. So we know it cognitively, and kind of like in our daily life experience, that makes sense. So the example would be, imagine the case of these two people that we built kind of like associated together. Imagine that by this means you already knew this person and you met her actually in a beach and you remember her because she gave you an ice cream, right? And you have this sort of like network about related to this. And imagine that this person, whenever you see them, when you see him, it reminds you actually of another like old people, maybe your grandpa, right? That who's currently living in London. So the point is that, right, this network could be higher and higher, complex and complex, and we still are not mixing up things. So somehow, some sort of like principal organization should also like impact into this. So according to the first experiment, right, the idea of like reactivating this memory might impact into this, and also simultaneously might impact into this. So at the end of the day, right, everything would be much together and it would be slightly like complex and chaotic. That would not be efficient or adaptive if you wish. So we need another mechanism. We need something that at least speaks about the possibility that that memories are kept organized somehow, right? Is that question?
Yeah. You briefly mentioned as inference process that would go on when you somehow have to infer that like the same dogma inferred that you would So this seems to be like some sort of like active inference process. That
Sure.
Do you think this like entirely depends on the hippocampus and just on the fact that like the two memories just simply overlap?
Well,
or do you think, because I would say that there's like also some other process that would interfere in this now and actually make this link, right? So what is the...
Well, I guess, these days, the evidence that we have these days, that this inferential processing can easily take place quite rapidly during encoding itself, and the mechanisms by which this happens are hippocampus dependent. We know other regions that are involved as well, but at least it seems to be some of like the mechanisms are specifically governed by the hippocampus or something in the hippocampus.
But is it done during the during stimulus presentation,
yes.
right?
So one of the mechanisms.
So there's like a link that is somehow like made on the spot, and then this is just consolidated afterwards.
That would be the idea. We do know at least as far I know, like 3 or 4 mechanisms that might be related to how we do inferential learning, at least from sort of like image-based associations. One of them is truly dependent on encoding, so it takes place quite rapidly. It might be susceptible to modifications or to emulations over time, like in semi-playable as well, and that's why we wanted to explore it here as well. Right. So just to so which is the mechanism, or which mechanism might play a role in here? Right. So we do have there's Ken Norman and colleagues suggested like a theoretical model, suggested a computational model called non-monotonic plasticity hypothesis. It was an hypothesis, but actually they show that associative learning, or the way you associate information, right, and the way you organize this information should be governed by principles of memory strength, something that we mentioned already, like in having notes. So the whole idea is that the strength of these associations might be high or lower, right? It's a function of whatever, priorities, rewards, whatever you wish. But the way of impact that memory reactivation might have into these associations fluctuates as a function of this strength. So that associations that are very high, or the strength of this association is high, right? Any reactivation, right, might impact by strengthening it. But critically, and that's important, when this association strength is not that high, let's say low or moderate, they also like explain this function, but low or moderate, right? Any reactivation might weaken the association, right? Might weaken instead of like strengthening. So that involves, in terms of like memory, memory functioning, it might, let's say, you can observe that instead of like benefiting, right, or potentiating your retrieval, it might actively highlight forgetting, right? So that might be quite efficient, I would say, right, in these cases, because, right, by by this principle of strength, of associative strength, we might, right, sleep or reactivation might help to keep this network heavily associated by those memories that are, right, important strength, the association is high, but also might also prevent these two memories, which are completely relevant to each other, to keep them separate. So that the idea itself and the concepts, I think it's quite reasonable.
You don't link that at all to Theta Gamma coding?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Sure. I'm going to talk about Theta Gamma right after this. Sure.
So in this concept, does every memory is there a core central node in the memory network that is the one that has to be imprinted or retained in order to allow the other ones to
Yes.
go?
So the whole, most of the models is
Or are they all, or
sure.
do they all need to be the equivalent strength for the entire network to be sure?
So I think we are in a kind of like a era of hippocampus centrality. So most of the models are dominated by the idea that hippocampus is an essential structure to coordinate many of these phenomena. So the neocortex, the cortical regions, are extremely relevant, but it seems to be, at least from according to the models, McLellan, there are many models. The DeepMind people is using also these sort of like models as well. It seems that there's this kind of like a dual system the whole time. Something that quickly learns and acquires these sort of like models of environment, and this is used by the neocortex to, right, to kind of like start sort of like representation level. And that's this sort of like governing kind of like principle is, I think it's flying over many of the cognitive neuroscientists and animal studies these days, animal scientists these days. And the whole idea, I think, sorry, I just, I jumped over all that. So one of the fundamental pieces in history that make this argument strong, at least in history point of view, is this finding, like on 60s, that we call, like, it was a patient. It was called the HM. Did you hear of that? So basically, so the whole point is that basically psychologists, neuroscientists, and many other people just found out by just one single case study. It was a, sorry, shall I just explain this case maybe just to make it easier?
Do it.
Yeah. Do you know about that HM case? So I just very briefly. So that was this guy who had like a chronic epilepsy, like the ones we used to for these studies. And at that time, this sort of like brain was a bit of a black box for humans. Basically, the neurologist decided to cure this epilepsy, to remove bilaterally the hippocampus in surrounding areas. Bilaterally. Sorry.
They removed it only unilaterally, not knowing. Scoville didn't know that he had already sclerosis of the left hippocampus. They took out the right one, thereby made him a bilateral hippocampus
Exactly.
patient.
Okay. That's good. So basically, at the end, so these two regions, or these two areas, end up being completely like disappeared from their life function.
But on top of that, Luis, when Henry Molaison died, and it is a post-mortem analysis on his brain.
Oh, I know that. I didn't want to get into this.
Okay.
No, I know. But that's kind of sort of like a controversy about this HN case. I mean, imagine the field itself builds up on one single case somehow, right? So that's a bit controversial. Now these days, this case has been like explored like kind of like very defined manner, and many aspects came out, and other controversies about the book, and this
And
journalist.
his brain, who owns his brain? There's a massive controversy about that as well.
I don't know.
Oh yeah,
Oh, really?
MIT is fighting with the guy in San Diego.
Oh,
who
yeah,
owns the
right,
brain.
exactly.
You know?
So imagine the case. I mean, this guy when he died, the brain was sliced in a very thin way to preserve it, and that was streamed online, and people were watching it. I mean, it's a really important case, at least from the human cognitive point of view, I'd say, right? Or, I don't know if it inspired like animal models, I guess. I'm not sure.
Not much.
Well, anyway, so the case. Sorry, just to make the point.
Okay, we jump
Just
forward.
because of this lesion, so it just happened. At that point, people was not aware of the importance of these areas in medical cognitive function. But what they basically found out is that when HM woke up, he lost most of the memories for his own life. And he also lost, not even because of that, he also lost the possibility to learn specific or to form new memories for specific information. Let's say what we call that, basically we call declarative memory. Say information like that you might experience and that you can declare. That these are the basic cognitive models. They also found actually that this guy could form new memories, but that was like based on like motor skills or other sort of learnings which are a bit implicit, like habits or things like this. So at the end, just because of this guy, a completely full and a really important and really like a influential model of how the memory is set up in the brain, basically has been contributed. So I think actually maybe these are days in which many of these kind of like taxonomies are slightly like challenged by many people, I'd say. I think we are in a kind of like a very nice and challenging moment. But anyway, just the way you mentioned. So
Also the neuropsychologist did a lot of the experiments who died recently. But there's also huge discussion now about that, right?
Yeah.
There's also her notes are not really accessible. There's
Oh,
a
yes.
question about biases and the kind of experiments that were done. So it's
well,
really
there's a general
it's
crisis in
beautiful.
psychology.
Because the textbook level is very clean, right?
Yeah,
It's very
exactly,
clear. But
exactly.
now it's a lot of
No, there's some controversy.
controversy.
No, it's like a senior now. So there's a book. Yeah. So that's the story. Sure.
Yeah, can I ask a question about your experiment? So, in your experiment, people look at an image, they go to sleep. So when they're looking at the image, you play a sound, so that they're associated with the sound. They go to sleep. While they're asleep, you play the sound again, and you assume that they replay the image through memory, and that provokes consolidation. And you find a nice effect of consolidation the next day in terms of recognition memory. But what maybe I missed, is there any independent verification you have that they have replayed the memory
No.
as a result of reading the sound? Okay.
No, wait, sorry, not in this experiments.
Okay.
People start showing that this sort of like cueing, this replay or this artificial, that sounds on these sort of like setups might really like be related to sort of like memory reactivation. And they do that, and I'm going to show about some of that. We do that inferentially. We have to use like pattern classification analysis, for instance. That allows us to identify basically on the means of offline activity, patterns of neural activity that were related statistically to those that re-emerge or that emerge while encoding. And now we're using these techniques. I'm going to talk about this in the next.
So what would be interesting is in your data, you might imagine that your data would be quite bimodal, but in some people you would have triggered a replay, and in other people there would be no effect. So you would see inside this effect that you have, which is a nice effect, that there might be a group of group of people for whom you just played the sound at the wrong time, they're thinking about something else. I mean, what does the data look like? Does it that idea?
That's a good point. We haven't explored this possibility.
It seems like a rather all or nothing thing. Or do you play it several times during the night?
No, we do that. We do that, but that's an important issue, and hasn't been explored so far. I'd say.
Yeah.
Actually, the idea is that. So that's an issue, isn't it? I mean, you have to repeat the sound, the presentation many times overnight to kind of like have an effect, behaviorally speaking.
And you play it during slow wave sleep.
Yes. That's something that I didn't enter, but that's an important aspect.
Right. So then that would be.
Yes. So we explored this possibility once, but the data wasn't convincing. That's it, because we didn't have that many repetitions in terms of that data. I think.
So how many repetitions typically?
For that case, we have like 7 repetitions for each of the stimuli.
Okay.
For that specific case, yeah. It's not that many, right? But this is an app study. So people, instead of going full night sleep, they go and have a nap for 45 minutes. So 90 minutes. So it also works well. Kind of. Sure.
Maybe you mentioned that doesn't the sound have to be related qualitatively?
No,
to stimulus?
no, that's the point. Exactly. So you might.
Because I saw Woof for the dog.
We did it in
and
here.
I was wondering, like.
No, we did it in here
Okay.
to facilitate this idea, right? That basically this association might be brought like easier, but because we can also control for these 2 memories, right? But in another experiment, in the other one, for instance, like other people are using like sounds which are not related.
Okay, arbitrarily.
Yes, so it seems that actually this kind of like a relationship, this degree of association is not like a critical ingredient. Shall I? Okay. So yes, so that was the story. And but now, I mean, finally, we can. How do we modulate? Sorry, we were here. How can we make sure, right, that we ask another group of people to make or to learn 2 memories, right? That even though they are overlapping in terms of content, features, right? Somehow the strength of this association is minimized compared to the other case. And we just came up with the easy solution to simply like delay the time, or basically extend the delay time interval between the first encoding and the second one. It's a simple solution, right? It was one of the passage of time, remember, 10 knows. One way to address this, of course, we do make the inference that makes happen. But somehow, right, when we test for memories, for these memories in a control study, right after this learning, right, and we compare to the other group of people who learn the 2 memories together, we observe, right, this is like a percentage of like correct recall of these memories right after learning this. We observe that actually the group that learned these 2 delayed decreased in performance. So somehow it seems, right, that this memory, right after learning this one, it's not that strong anymore. And that's what we expect, right? That's kind of like 3 hours passage of time. Right, so having said this phenomena, then we repeat exactly the same thing. The group, they learn these 2 things with 3 hours delay. They watch a movie in between just to control for interference. And then we ask them to go to sleep, to have this nap, and we play back half of the sounds as we did before. But now, actually, the effects are completely like the opposite. So these are basically, right? Sorry. That was the cases for the first experiment. So these are the benefits of those people, right, who had the 2 learning continuously. So the 2 memories are highly active right at the moment of sleeping, and we observe the benefits of reactivating half of them, right? Now see what happened for the other group. And we see what happened for the memories that were initially encoded. And they arrive during sleep quite low in terms of strength. We, of course, see a decrease of our performance because they've been like 3 hours delayed before sleeping. But we see actually that reactivation basically impact completely the opposite manner. So that those memories that where the association information was reactivated impact heavily by making the overlapping one to be more forgotten, or more frequently forgotten. We also explored neural oscillations. I'm going to enter into a bit of this, but just to show you, and not to enter into this is like a standard like plot of how neural responses might, basically the neural responses take place when the sound is played during sleep. We can see which sort of neural responses are happening, and we can study the means of like evoke responses, oscillations that were within here. And I just wanted to show you, these would be like the neural responses while people are sleeping, for sounds, right, for the sounds, for the continuous group, so those that were, the two memories were completely like highly associated. And this is like the neural response or the neural oscillatory activity when the sound is presented for the play group. And just to show you that there's something completely different or quite different in one specific frequency band that basically shows in one specific group. Why is it happening? Right back, we could discuss these things. But the important aspect here is, I say, that there's something that seems to be happening specifically when you present the sound during sleep, which is basically right the point of the experiment. Right. So sleep provokes the release of interrelated memory networks by strengthening strongly associated memories and weakening weakly associated memory representations, and sleep memory reactivation impacts adaptively into overlapping memories, avoiding cluttering and the consolidation of unreliable information. That's good. I think it's kind of like a nice message. And this is, of course, like the data we present or we have here.
Wait, sorry. How can you come to the conclusion on preventing cluttering?
No, that's an assumption.
Ah, good.
Thank you.
No,
That's an important message.
I thought I followed the story, and it's only something.
No, the idea of cluttering follows because imagine, right? So for the same principle, whenever you reactivate something, and that expressed over the network of associated memories, right? One may think, somehow this should stop somewhere, right?
Yeah.
We need some sort of like a organizative.
That's Theta gamma, right?
That's the gamma.
Sure.
So I'm going to talk about that now.
Okay.
Sure.
No, so here you were saying because of time,
Mm-hmm.
right? Sort of memory, this effect of consolidation is diminished, and
Yeah.
therefore you will not form
Mm.
highly cluttered memories.
Exactly.
By necessity, these are restricted memory
Exactly.
networks.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. So somehow there's some sort of like organizational principles that are also taking place during sleep. There's something happening in there. So it's not just the automatic reactivation of whatever you know, it's not just a simple pattern completion phenomenon. Whatever you reach, it's going to be strengthened.
Right.
There's some sort of like organization.
But now you still have to explain why the memory that was, you were exposed to 3 hours prior to being exposed to the sound cue
Mm-hmm.
is actually diminished. Right? So do you ascribe it to some memory instability?
Mm-hmm.
Right? There's also this idea
Sure.
that reactivating memories is due to instability.
Mm-hmm.
These guys might be
Sure.
under sort of a threshold value.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah, this is what-
No, that's a good point.
Mhm.
So that's another, well, in cognitive neuroscience sometimes we have to do this, so this is in psychology, right? We do have like a behavioral phenomenon, which is like the representational, which is basically the mechanism that explains this decrease in performance. Could be many, one of those definitely could be this one. We don't know. It's important because at the mechanistic level, one should deal with this. But with this experiment, we just wanted to kind of like show, or wanted to kind of like examine actually, if there was any sort of like organizational principle. But you're completely right. If you want to get into the network itself and explain that mechanistically, well, something else should be explored.
Mhm.
But I guess it's right. This is like the system level thing, right? Different levels.
Right.
Sure.
With that diagram before the video, whereabouts is this activity?
That was fully well. In this case, theta activity, theta seemed to be slightly dominating more like the frontal regions.
Right.
It's kind of like expressed all over the scalp. This is like an EEG stuff.
Okay.
So that's a scalp EEG, sorry. So that's a bit of like I didn't explain that. And the beta seems to be dominant all over in
Yeah.
most of the senses. But you know that actually the EEG is quite not reliable in terms of like source space.
So you
Also imagine actually these guys are sleeping, so the EEG is quite like modulated by slow waves, which is something that we also know. So it's not a standard way of seeing neural responses, but still the patterns were quite different.
Is the hypothesis that you're pushing that the reactivation of the memory during sleep is strengthening the representation of the hippocampus, or is it strengthening the representation of cortex?
Good. You're right.
Okay.
So the point, right? So the model, basically, no, that's a good point. No, to start with, the model, exactly. So one of the models, like the dual system model, at system levels, one of the kind of dominant views these days is that at a certain point, these traits of information would disappear from the hippocampus. That's one of the possibilities. Another model, the multiple trace theory, for instance, in humans, states actually there's always something, right, some sort of like index or pointer that will be, right, stored in the hippocampus. Right, we cannot address this issue. It's a really like important issue, right?
But you have intracranial recordings of these patients as well?
No,
Really?
but that would be the next.
They're not implanted.
They're not, but that would be the next step. That would be important. That would be critical, definitely. There was another question like this.
In these studies, how do you differentiate sleep to just absence of stimuli? In the sense, what is the role of awareness in this? Let's say, how do you compare?
Okay. Well, in sleep, so sleep is one of these brain stages that are basically accompanied by particular neural activity, and it's known from like ages, like they use it like for polysomnography. I don't know if you know these things, right? So the only way, so that we can basically kind of ensure based on these parameters when and which stage people is well sleeping. So stage 2, deep sleep, REM, whatever. We can do that based on these parameters. But we also counted here micro arousals, what they call it, right? So the idea that when you sleep, every now and then, like you might because of the stimulation, for instance, people like kind of like wakes without being awake, right? Kind of like aroused bit. That's what they call micro arousals. So there's some neural responses as well in the Theta and other sort of like neural responses that can be observed actually at the naked eye, and we control for that. We make sure that this activity was not a micro arousal. That was one of the questions of one of the reviewers. The push, and that's an important part. Yes, please.
Oh, first, thank you for the very, very nice presentation. I have a question and a comment. The question is, forgive me because this is all new for me. Do the rules for memory activation or reactivation during sleep, I assume they apply to a normal brain, but what happens with people with a psychiatric disorder,
Yes,
like
yes.
a bipolar disease, or is the same?
No, well, so sleep consolidation, so the idea that memory consolidates should, as far as I know, at least with these sort of studies, has not been brought into psychiatric patients, as far as I know. So most of the people who explore these neurological cases, because they are so useful to test for models.
Because I assume.
So I tell you the truth, to be honest, I don't know of a study. I know that psychiatric population have some sort of like issues on sleep, and sleep physiology itself, but I'm not aware of any like. That could be the case, right? Sleep with psychotic patients, for instance.
Yes,
That could be really cool.
so in the second.
Yes. Yeah, I'm afraid I don't have an answer to
The
this. I don't know if
second-
anybody knows what it is. That could be a really good one. So like for instance, like this principles of organization completely wash out, isn't it?
Yeah.
Good.
So the second is more of a general, it's a comment in your talk, and you gave me a very, very good idea. And don't laugh because this is serious. After you have sex with your partner, usually you go back to sleep. So if they complain now, you can say, no, preserve the memory. I'm serious.
I want to remember.
I don't know this guy, so.
And then you wake up and you forget her name again, right?
But the problem with that
The
is,
same applies whether you are in the United States or Spain, doesn't matter.
the problem with that is that if you don't go to sleep right after, that would be a bad indicator.
So why do you think we asked Luis to give the opening talk, right?
So now you can say thanks to
You
those
show me how to
people.
talk about secrets.
Exactly.
So, right, so let's move on.
Yeah.
Right, so now we know that this kind of like memory reactivation seems to be a kind of like critical mechanism, right? To basically form a memory that might be preserved for a long time. That's good. But we still have another problem. So we know, right, that our daily life experience is extremely complex. We cannot just rely on things that are happening on sleep, during sleep, to make memory durable, or like, right? We need something happening online, something that just happened when you encounter something. We need something in there. Especially not just because it's complex, but because like most of our experience is very brief. Things are just happening on a continuous fashion. So that's why psychologists, we brought up this kind of like concept, which is quite relevant, which is called like short-term memory. I'm not sure you're familiar with this, but basically at the end, conceptually speaking, it's just this ability of our memory systems to preserve some sort of like representations offline for a very short period of time, right? We don't know this time yet. People speak about like 10 seconds, 30 seconds, right? We don't know that. It's a conceptual. But somehow, right, I think we've been familiar with this. Remembering numbers, right? Telephone numbers, all these sort of things. We remember that for a few seconds and then the day after are completely gone, right? So this is an important memory. So because reactivation seems to be a mechanism quite critical for any sort of like transformation of like direct inputs from experience into a memory trace, we thought that maybe one possibility is that whenever you have to preserve information over the maintenance period, let's say for 5-10 seconds, right? The mechanism, the critical ingredient that makes this available, or makes this possible, is through reactivations. So basically, kind of like rounds around like many reactivations of the features of your environment, so that you can access, in case you need it, right after. So the way we test this possibility was as follows. So this is like a delayed microsample task, quite simple, right? So the whole point is that you ask people to encode an image like this one, right? This image stays 3 seconds in front of you, then it disappears. It asks you to kind of like preserve this information during 5 seconds offline. There's nothing there because, and that's the important point, right after, right, you'll be asked to select between 2 possible pictures which was the one that was presented right before. Right? That seems to be kind of like a simple task. But in this particular condition, the task was not that simple, because if you compare these 2 images, the 2 were quite similar, and only specific, what we call configural or spatial features of the elements were moved. If you see in that case, this sort of like, whatever it is, right, this kind of like sort of thing, were slightly displaced compared to the original. So you had to in order to make this, to perform well in this task, it's not just, right, you have to preserve, you have to maintain on memory, not just, right, kind of like a gist information of like the image itself, but also all the details and how they were associated over the space, right? So that was kind of like a task thing. Now, we want to test if, so the whole point is, to what extent neural patterns of activity elicited in here, which we assume are basically, right, the inputs that basically related to this encoding of information, are replayed during this maintenance period, right? How do we test this these days? Okay, this is like an MEG experiment, this is magnitude encephalography, so I don't know if you're familiar with this. It's basically the same sort of like similar to EEG in the sense that you are picking up like very rapid like fluctuations of like, instead of like electrical activity of the scalp, you pick up like magnetic fields changes, right? But it has a very fine-grained temporal resolution of milliseconds. So basically run this. And it can be kind of like a slightly like depicted in something like this. That would be like this is like an MEG activity, right? Of like many channels over the head, right? And so the whole point is that in order to identify replay, we used this activity on basically of the head of many participants, and we used pattern classification algorithm, right? It is what we call like a multivariate pattern classification algorithm. In that case, we used one with the hidden layers. And the whole point is that we assume, or we wanted to see, just to start with, to what extent, or we assume that this pattern classification would allow us to identify patterns of activity of the brain that might differ between, at least in that case, 2 sort of like picture conditions or picture categories. We use like indoor and outdoor pictures. So once these patterns were identified over the time, right, assuming that that was right, the way we represent this information, now we have this pattern already stored in this network, we could test during the offline period whether these same patterns reappear at any point. So that's the idea of a replay, right? We mentioned it before. Importantly, just to make sure that any sort of like results were found in here were functionally relevant, right? We also included 2 more conditions, just to make sure that this replay thing was something that is not just based on, let's say, kind of like automatic procedure. That's something meaningful in terms of like, we asked the same participants in a different block right, in different like moments of experiment, to make exactly the same task. But this case, right, they had similar images, but the test was relatively simple. So the pictures were completely different to the encoding, so people could easily perform well, right, without the need to preserve all the information, all the data, all the associations, right? And we also had another control condition in which people were aware of this when they went into the block, in which they were required to watch something, to see a picture, but then at the test, there was a completely different story. They just were asked to identify or to say or to select whether the two pictures were similar or not, something that is not related entirely to what they had encoded. So assuming that there was what we call a delay period without any sort of like maintenance requirements, right? So which are the findings we had? So in this figure, you have like this would be like the percentage of subjects that we had, in which the classifier, let's say, set or guessed correctly that the neural pattern, right, the time period, which is like 5 seconds, right, these specific time points, right, it basically picks up, or it depicts the time points at which specific neural patterns elicited right at the offset of the picture, right? So the picture were presented at time point 0, let's say somewhere here, these 44 milliseconds, 124, blah, blah, right, up to 1 second, very initial. To what extent these neural patterns, that were time resolved over time, were represented again, right, over the maintenance period. So, and I think it's quite kind of like clear from this image itself, even though it's just a percentage, that right, the amount of like, let's say, reactivation, amount of like classification accuracy for the three conditions was completely different, right? So the control condition was a delay period in which there was no maintenance period, there was no maintenance requirements at all. Therefore, we are not finding so many like correct classification of the patterns. For the non-configurable, they were required to maintain information, right? Because the test was related to the encoding, but still it was not needed to preserve all the details and especially organization of the elements. And for the configurable, actually, it was kind of like tough, right? And that's why we assumed actually that people had to kind of like replay more frequently and more consistently over time the neural patterns that were elicited during encoding. And that's basically, this is the summary of this, like sort of statistics on this. Yes?
It's two questions. What is the time window that you use for this?
Well, yeah?
So, yeah, so every point on the x-axis, like it's a classification accuracy.
Yes, so that's one of the nice things I think about this sort of like electrophysiological measures in humans. You might not have access to a kind of like sources, right? You can just go deep and make inference about like regions of the brain, but you may be able to have, I would say, independent, but some sort of like specific neural patterns at every time, at every millisecond level.
So that's a millisecond level.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
So is it like a realistic timing for print statement, like 1 millisecond?
No, this is that panel that just shows the rehearsal. Where the rehearsal takes place during the 5 seconds, how many times was the picture evoked? I mean, assuming that all this works.
Sure.
So it simply shows how much did they rehearse, how much did they actively try to remember.
Yeah, no, this I get it, but
it's not memory; it's simply working memory.
Yes.
Yeah, but you would at every time point you make a classification.
Yes.
So that classification takes like a specific amount of data, right?
Yes.
So that's 1 millisecond data. So
No, in that case it was a bit more. It was like a windows of like 50 milliseconds, I think.
So it's like a sliding.
It's sliding window, yes.
Ah, okay.
Yes. And that's based on like patterns of something I wanted to mention afterwards. But this is like based on like patterns, oscillatory neural activity at the gamma band. It's a beta and gamma actually.
Okay. Because this was precisely like my point. You know?
Right.
Depending
So
on
it's
like the
something-
resolution that you use, you're gonna get into specific oscillator data.
Yes, yes.
So it's not an arbitrary choice.
It's
Using
not
1
very choice.
millisecond.
But that makes, because of the next point I'm going to explain now.
But wait, there's a problem with this interpretation, right? Because for the subject, at the encoding phase, we are encoding a stimulus, and then we have a memory a maintenance period. From the perspective of memory, you would expect it to be rehearsing to the same extent, right? So if you look at the reoccurrence of MEG patterns during encoding, they should reoccur equally often in your control condition as in your configurable condition, if it has anything to do with memory.
this is actually rehearsed.
Well, in the control condition, they know there was the test itself, nothing.
Well,
Right.
this is not affected in the background now, right? The task instruction
Mhm.
is the modulator of this pattern,
Exactly.
right? So that we have to keep it in mind.
Okay.
Because
no, that's
apparently-
important. You're right.
Right now, apparently,
I fully, sorry, I just, so whether what people is doing during this mentoring period is inferential in the sense that we don't know if they are truly rehearsing it or not.
exactly.
I agree. But I think the next slide kind of like contributes to the possibility that they are doing something different.
But and the other point is in the memory period in your configurable condition. Can you say anything about the localization of?
Now I will a bit.
Okay.
Well, no, sorry, just a bit because it's like a scout thing again.
Sure, but we're jumping outside of hippocampus.
Sure,
in some sense.
sure.
That's the point, right?
Yeah, well, with the RPG, you are kind of like sensitive to the possibility to pick up some sort of like campus.
No, but that's why I'm curious about
Sure.
localization.
Right.
This was visual, this was back here, wasn't it?
Yeah, most of the activity. Well, when we explored how these gamma patterns distribute over the space of the scalp space, we observed that many of them were at the back. But some others were not just in the back. And we know from other papers. Yeah, sorry. Just to follow up with this. Now we wanted to explore which mechanism, right, apart from the reinstatement itself, this rapid reinstatement might also, right, bring or allow this replay, right, to be organized during this maintenance period. So it's not just a matter of like how much you replay information, but also would there be any sort of like mechanism that allows this kind of like amount of replay to be coordinated and organized in a way, right, offline, in a way that whenever you want to bring it back or use it for the test, this information is still, well, let's say, with a high quality, let's say, right? So for that, there's a very influential model, and kind of like well known in the animal and human field and of memory, which is something was described by John Leishman a few years ago. And the model is, I think the beautiful model is that it's quite sensitive, it's quite simple in conceptually speaking, and it's been shown to be effective in explaining many phenomena that we observe, like with MEG, with EG, with cortical data, animal studies. And the whole point is that, well, basically, the model states is that whenever you encode or whenever you have to like any sort of like event representation, right, is basically captured by multiple elements or multiple features that are encoded over the gamma or high gamma oscillatory activity. That's what the model says. Now basically cope with this kind of like distributed possible representation over the cortex. Now the critical point, again, with the idea of the hippocampus, is that there's some sort of like mechanism, possibly driven by the hippocampus, again, right, that basically allows one to preserve all this feature, or this complex feature of representation bound together, right? In this figure, in this kind of like a schema, imagine that you have like a memory code for, let's say, or code for the memory A, which will be represented by like this sort of like several neurons, right? So the whole point is that how do you keep all this information tied together so that whenever you have to recall it, you can use it again and visualize it if you wish. So the whole point is that through a principle by which this gamma activity couples to a slow rhythm on the theta range, let's say for 8 Hertz in the hippocampus, this kind of like coupling of the phase activity of the theta range allows us to preserve an organized or sequential, if you wish, bound representation of this kind of like gamma-based features of the brain. So the whole point is that, we just mixed up a few things here. So imagine that one information, right, it's called like as A, right, and then it's followed by another pattern, right, whatever you wish, or another feature, which is coded by these neurons. So we need to know, right, that this information should be split up separately, and one might actually take place right after the other one. We want to keep this information, this sequentiality, this complex feature, this information together. So the idea would be that the theta model, the theta oscillations, through theta phase coupling, would reinstate like features of like coding of information of A, let's say, at one specific phase location or a specific phase stage, and that would follow by another phase reactivation, and that would follow right after, well, many others if you wish. So that at every time of the theta cycle, the full memory will be reactivated, but on a specific position of theta stage. So that's why theta, right, the theta phase would be a critical mechanism to organize this kind of complex information. So that whenever you want to retrieve, right, information D, right, that would come up together with the rest of the information in an ordered fashion, right? In fact, even though it sounds a bit like this, kind of like weird, we do have evidence that something in that line might work actually great. Sorry.
I was wondering what kind of information could be represented by this
Yeah.
in an image. Because if you have a sequence of numbers, that's more or less clear.
Yes, you're right. Well, the other possibility is that you transform these kind of like spatial features into sort of like sequential information. I mean, I agree that we cannot like rely on the possibility that the same sequential principle, like sequentiality of the coding, could be fully implemented into this task. But I think there are reasons to understand or to believe actually like spatial or confural relations, if you wish, might be captured by similar principles. I mean, John Nisman made this model, and then there was this kind of like advance of the model by Ole Jensen, who basically using the same sort of like coding mechanism made the inference that working memory and the complexity of like information could be coded as well with similar sort of like principle. Recently, they just showed that actually this may be the case for numbers for sequences. Right, just to finish up with this. So basically, in animal studies, using like electrophysiology and single cell encodings in the hippocampus, they show that during this is like a rodent study in which the rodent was like asked was encoding during this time period, like encoding something specific. I don't fully remember that moment. And then they had to preserve this information that was encoded between these two bars, right, over the maintenance period, so that it can be used afterwards for specific tests. I think the important aspect here is that this study and many others show that during this maintenance period, there's some sort of like an increase of theta oscillations on the hippocampus, right? And that seems to be related somehow to some sort of like sequential representation of single unit information. Do you see that? So it seems actually that this sort of like a coding solution for working memory seems to be quite effective, at least from rodent studies. One of the nice things that actually we like for that point is that when people studying this sort of like a working memory or how the brain deals with this kind of maintenance period of complex or relational or spatial information, sometimes they fail to see the involvement of the hippocampus with fMRI, with functional MRI. Why is it the case? Maybe one possibility is that actually the fMRI or the MRI, right? It's not sensitive to this sort of like coding phenomena, right? Because you need to be, you need some sort of like a measure that is sensitive to very subtle and coupling of different like network codings that are not sensitive to that. So basically, based on this evidence, the way we addressed this possibility was by simply like getting for each of the participants, getting the time point at which the reactivation of replay was found during the maintenance period, and try to link it by phase coupling analysis. Try to see if they, all over the time point, occurred at a specific theta phase state. There was a simple theta, kind of like a phase coupling phenomenon. So the idea is that if replay takes place specifically, specific theta phase stages over the maintenance period, then by collecting theta phases over all of these time periods, we would assume there should be some sort of like a concentration towards some sort of a specific phase, right? Imagine this scenario. Imagine that would be the case for this specific time period. Now we would observe, right, by doing that replay tends to take place over like the peak of theta, but not in the throat, for instance, right? If we just get and collapse all this information, right, from a kind of like a rose plot, and we do some sort of like analysis into this, we might observe that there's some sort of like bias of this phase organization towards some sort of like a distribution. That's what we measure. And sorry.
Just before you get too far into this, just want to point out that there is no other way it can be in a brain except for theta gamma coupling, because they can only couple if they interact via membranes. So when you have theta fluctuation of a membrane, anything other that goes through that membrane, such as gamma, is going to ride on that theta, because the excitability of the cell is partly determined by whatever synaptic influences are done by the theta oscillation. So you're always going to get a gamma riding on specific phases on theta, and particularly on the excitatory phase, the peaks of the gamma, and they are going to be very specific because of the membrane potentials. So this doesn't go as far as Lissman and Jensen think, and in fact, as a matter of fact, the whole genre of that proposal stems from their false, from their methodologically false attempt to get the sharpening of hippocampal place cell precision by adding this gamma theta business, by seeing where the phase of gamma would sharpen the place cell. Their methods should never have passed the review board, and it's very unfortunate that this is. Lots of people have tried to look for the sharpening of place cell behavioral place cell activity by taking theta phase into account. Nobody found it except Lissman and Jensen. And when you look at the data, you see it's an artifact of the fact that they knew when the animal was performing well, and they selected data to fit their hypothesis. And it's very unfortunate that this has been propagated in the literature. And I will give you some papers later where I have addressed all these problems in footnotes mostly, and nobody, of course, pays any attention. So it's very unfortunate.
But that's why we have you here, Björn.
I'm here to keep you all honest.
Exactly. But
on the thing
thing
I
is,
know.
But don't forget that the way you explain theta gamma as being necessarily coupled does not necessarily invalidate the data that is presented right now, right? But you're just saying.
Oh no, I'm saying.
Of course, it has to be like this.
I'm
right?
saying it's just like you're saying.
Yeah.
I'm saying it's exactly like you're saying, but it may not mean all that you think it means by showing that. That's all I'm saying. In other words, if you could show me the specific packets of information, if you can show me how they are sequenced in that way, I would be even then there are problems.
Well, there's
But I'll give you the papers. later.
Sure. But how about the place? There's all the spatial navigation studies.
Yeah,
Phase precession.
Yes, exactly.
Phase precession, that's what they try to explain. The phase precession, the only paper that has shown a function for phase precession of theta in the hippocampus is the Lissman and Jensen. And phase precession is completely accepted. That's what O'Keefe himself showed very early, 73 or something. Okay, now phase precession is a phenomenon that's there, and it has nobody this far except Lissman and Jensen have found any use for that phase precession whatsoever. The big hypothesis was phase precession increases the precision of place behavior in the maze.
Sure.
Okay? So people started looking for behavioral evidence that it actually, and everybody failed to show it except Lissman and Jensen, and they have a gross mistake in their method.
I'm not sure that's really true.
Yes.
Burgers has also data.
Yes, Burgess, I have cited them in my paper.
They do show sort of systematically maps to the distance of the animal to the location, right? But maybe we should have
But
a separate discussion session on
we have a little
distance.
session on
Yeah?
this. I'd love to.
Good. All right. So you're all signed up for the Björn debunks the theta gamma process.
Yeah. Not the theta gamma coupling, which
No,
is
code.
inevitable. Code, yes. Code, I'm debunking. I debunk all codes.
Oh, really?
Okay, sorry.
Oh, that's for me. That's a breakthrough.
And you see, if you disagree with Björn, he gives you stuff to read. So you better make up your mind. Disagree with him again.
But maybe we should read this paper. I mean, you should definitely send it to me. I'm kind of like sending curious about this.
We'll get it right now.
Absolutely.
We'll get it. I have it here.
Super.
Okay,
Sure, and just maybe.
that's 24, it's 1:24,
Yeah, you have
6
it
more
too.
minutes, and then,
It's okay.
then people will start to get the invitation.
Okay. So I think I just,
You switched off your computer.
I don't know what happened. Oh yes, that's not my thing.
Maybe you're not connected anymore?
It's-
No, you just switched off his computer.
Well, anyway. So basically by,
Improvise.
yeah, by doing this analysis, we just found out actually that this theta concentration, like degree of concentration, was different. It occurred statistically with this maintenance period. It was distributed like differently over the scalp sense of space. So that the configural elements or the configural maintenance showed this sort of like phase coupling or this phase concentration over like I would say temporal scalp regions, while the non-configural, though that was slightly easier, showed this sort of like typical frontoparietal distribution. So that would basically allow us, or basically suggest to us, that actually this theta coupling to reactivation might be relevant to preserve this information. And then we thought at that time, but maybe I'll change my mind. So basically, these are basically the sensors, and we observe that there's some sort of like a theta concentration, right? We're not speaking about the gamma itself, but concentration over different like networks, right? As a function of which sort of information you should preserve. And then we also observed that there was a correlation with behavior. So basically, we end up by this kind of like sort of like a conclusion. Yes.
What you talked about phases of classification occurs? Is it? I guess like what you are relating like phase with.
So the phase concentration at the end gives you an index, one simple value.
Yeah, but what is the value that you are plotting over phase? Is the classification accuracy?
No, sorry, no. So we identified over time when, right, for each sensor, right, so over time, when our classifier tells us there's a limit.
Yes, it's the classification.
It's the threshold, right?
So it's the classification accuracy that you're plotting?
Yeah, no, but
That's
is it again? Is it again? Yeah.
Classification accuracy?
Yes, and then we take theta time points.
Yeah.
Sure, yeah, exactly.
Okay,
You should look at the classification score over theta cycles, right?
No, well,
Phase,
that's phase, how do you call that? Phase concentration analysis. So we just took all the phases. We didn't do it parametrically in the sense that it's not a phase amplitude coupling.
No. I was just wondering like.
Okay. Well, I think it's a.
It's phase classification accuracy coupling.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Good. And so that's basically the data. And these are the conclusions. So basically, maintenance of complex relational information at short term involves a periodic replay. We term like periodic because it fitted to a theta cycle of neural patterns and during encoding. We assume that has to be, at that point, we assume that had to be something related with this theta gamma model because the pattern classification was running at high and kind of a wide oscillatory activity of the brain. But of course, we are far away. It's a system level thing. So I think actually I should stop here because otherwise I will enter into another study.
That's great, Luis.
Yes.
Thank you so much.